Shavua Tov, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Sorry, it's a tiny bit late. Today's daf, this is the last Motzaei Shabbat of Masechet Bava Kamma. It's been a long time. So congratulations for making it to the last week, I should say. Next week will be Bava Mitzia. So get your Gemara ready. And does anyone remember where he got up to on Friday? Sorry, let me look on my phone. Nine lines from the bottom. Okay, everyone can hear me, right? We're good? You guys, can you hear me? Any affirmation here?
Yeah, I can hear you.
That yes is okay. So he got the
All good. I got you loud and clear.
perfect. That's what I'm looking for. Yes. So 9 lines from the bottom of Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amud, and I'm sure everyone was very excited on Friday and the days before to discuss the question of Dina de Malchuta Dina, which is of course a very, very both controversial and seminal halakha in terms of how Jews live their lives in the real world. But without doing more than just saying that introduction. So 9 lines from the bottom says Rava. Man de mishtakach, so we're daf kuf yud gimel mebet, 9 lines from the bottom. Amar Rava, man de mishtakach bebeidari. Let's say you are found in your warehouse. So the case here, Rashi explains, is that you have many partners. Let's say he says 4 partners, right? Who harvest a field or grow a field together. They get produce, say, worth $10,000, right? And the government takes 10%. They live in a low tax country, and they've got to pay $1,000 to the government. And what happens is that 3 of the partners take their grain and go home, and the 4th one is left back in the warehouse. And the government official shows up and says, "I want $1,000," and he has, $2,500 worth left behind, and they collect the whole thing from him. So that is considered to be legitimate because one partner should pay for his other partners and then go and collect from them. But the tax collector who collected that is not stealing because he's legitimately collecting from one partner for all of them. So in that case, someone who is found left behind in the warehouse, para manta demalka, he has to pay alone the tax for the melech. And Rashi says the implication is that that's not stealing. It's not inappropriate for them to collect for all of them. And then he can go to his partners and make them pay him back. Hani mili shutfa, but that's only if they're partners. Aval arisa, if you're a sharecropper, right? Let's say you work in this field and you collect 30% at the end, so you get $3,000 worth of grain, and the government comes to you and says, "Give us the $1,000." You don't have a responsibility to pay for the owner because you're not a partner, you're a sharecropper, and therefore, if they force you to pay, they're stealing from you, and therefore it's considered geneva, and you can't buy from them. So arisute hudakamapik. He's just doing his own arisut, and he doesn't have to pay for the partners. Vama Rava. Furthermore, said Rava, and this is again a fascinating halakha. I don't really have any idea how it applies today or in Jewish societies, but says Rava, when we think about taxes, it's actually not even taxes that are individual taxes. Let's say the government has a tax per head, right? They used to call that the karga. We'll read about it in a little bit. That was like not the poll tax, but like a person tax. Every year, every person had to pay $1,000, let's say. The responsibility for that tax lies on each individual in the town for all the other individuals of the town. Meaning the government can come to one person and say, pay tax for your neighbor who's not home. We should understand this to mean if he's not available, right? And you have a responsibility just by being their neighbor. You're not related to them. You don't have partnership with them, but living in the same town involves this responsibility. Again, how this is quantified is not so clear and might depend on the circumstance. But says the Gemara, says Rava, abarmata mi avet. You can take a avot. An avot, remember, is a mashkon, right? If you lend someone money, you take their clothing to hold and guarantee. The tax collector is allowed to take a mashkon for one neighbor for someone else in the city because it's your responsibility as a neighbor in the city to make sure your neighbor pays up. But Hani Mili, this is only true about Devrala Ara. This is the tax for land, like the property tax, or cargo, which is the head tax, the personal tax, the Haishata of the coming year. Avashata de Chalif. But if they come to collect for last year, then you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay for your neighbor. Because Hoel Afayis Malka Chalif, maybe since the person appeased the king, right, and got rid of the tax collectors, they don't have to pay. So you don't have a responsibility for the previous years. Once that year is passed, it's over. But for the current or future years, you would have to pay. Vamar Rava, 6 lines on the bottom. Hani Didari Dari, Betocha Haina Didari, right? The Dari, sorry. Those who are Dari is an interesting job. It was a gardening manure service where you'd pay people to provide manure, but the way they used to provide manure, they didn't have trucks with bags. They had animals that walked around. They would build a pen, right, a dari, and they would go to the bathroom on your field to make it ready for the next year. So these people would walk around town basically with their animals, and you'd pay them money for them to spend a couple days over your plot. Says the Rava, if they are betocha tchum, if they're doing their job inside the city limits, meaning tchum is 2,000 amot outside the city, so near the city, then asr likach mihem. You can't buy an animal from those people. Why not? Because my time, because when they take their band of animals around, they collect some, locals that they steal, basically. So because they're doing this within the borders of the city, not literally the borders, but the tchum of the city. So nearby the city, we assume that they steal animals and you can't buy from them. But if they do it chutz the tchum, mutar lekach michem. But if they're doing this out in the wilds, then you can assume that they didn't take anyone else's animal because animals wouldn't have escaped and gone there, and therefore you can buy an animal from them. And says
Who's stealing the
Ravina,
animals? Who's doing the stealing here of the animals?
yeah, so this is a group of Rashi's, they're not Jewish, but it doesn't matter. There's a group of people, I think that's what Rashi says. Yeah, it's Rashi's, they're not Jews, but there's a group of people who basically going around with this animal service, right? So they have 10 animals, and they'll go to your field and they'll provide manure over a few days, and that's what you pay for. But the question
The
is,
fresh manure service.
it's a mobile manure service, exactly. The question is,
Fresh, very fresh.
we assume that if they do this close to the borders of the city, we assume that any animal that escapes from the pen, right, and runs out 1,000 amot, which is close to the border, they're going to sweep it up among their crew, and you'll never be able to differentiate clearly what's their animal and what's not. And since that's the case, and that's likely, you shouldn't do business with them. It's like doing business with someone, selling stuff from the back of a truck, basically. But if it's far away from the city, then you have to assume that if there's extra animals, people either gave up on them or they're not belonging to anyone. That's how they got that far out. But says
People
Ravina,
didn't brand animals back then?
I guess not. But says Ravina, maybe speaking to your point, right? If the owner is chasing after them and saying, "Oh my gosh, my cows are part of your, you stole my animals," then afilu chutz l'tchum, then even if they're 10 miles away, it's not maybe the equivalent to James's branding, right? If there's reason to be suspicious, then this is an arbitrary definition. It's not like the tchum means they're stolen or not stolen. It just means what do you assume? And this, of course, goes to all these principles, which is that these are generalities. But if we know that either it's not stolen or it is stolen, that would change the way we behave. So
If
that
the people are in the town and they're bringing animals from one, don't you know that they're part of the town? That you know these people, and these people are working in the town and they're they're moving animals. They're recognizable. They're known people.
No, so it's basically a band of, you have a Jewish town. These people are not part of the town. They show up, in the spring or the fall, whenever you show up, I don't know, with their 20 camels, let's say, or whatever, and they want to provide a service. So the question is, do you assume that they have taken animals from the town they swept up things that are inappropriate? And that depends on how close they're working to town. And as Ravina said, it also depends on whether someone comes and claims that they did. And if they did, then it would be prohibited to do business with them.
Which means that if the following year, they probably are not going to be able to come back to the same place because they would be recognized.
If everyone's missing their animals, you're saying?
Yeah.
Potentially, but I don't know. I'm not that familiar with this business model. Machriz Rava. Now, Rava announced something very important. Rava announcing this means that, this was really an important statement. And some said it was Rafuna. And he said the following, 3 lines from the bottom. This Salkin Li'ila, those who go up are those who go to Eretz Yisrael, which was always considered to be higher than all lands. And those who go down to Bavel, right? Take this, this is an important rule. Remember this, wherever you go to live. Hi Bar Yisrael. If you have a Jew, the Yada Sahaduta Ligoy is the Gersa I have. I don't know what the real Gersa should be. but he knows testimony about a non-Jew, right? Let's say a Jew. We'll see the case in a second. A Jew says to a non-Jew, "You borrowed $1,000 from me," and this other Jew is a witness that in fact that's the case, that he borrowed money. Says, I'm going to take out the next words because the Gra says they're clearly added. Lotavu mine be'azov va'ashidle bedine degoyim al Yisrael chavre, and you go testify in a non-Jewish court about another Jew. Mishamtinale, we excommunicate. We put you in nidui, right? We put you in chirim. So the Gra says that the words that were added, he said were added because of the censor, which say, and they didn't ask you to come and testify. Right, so it gives an out that if they asked you, you can go. But he says those are added and they're not in any other old sources. But that's the statement that Rav has said. Don't testify against a Jew in a non-Jewish court. My taima, why not? Because the innu mafki memona apumedachat. Because they, in the non-Jewish court, they will extract money based on one witness. And the Torah says that you have to have two witnesses. So you're going to go to court and say truthfully that I saw this Jew borrow $1,000 from the non-Jew, but that's not enough, la halacha. And so by you going and being complicit to that, you're causing them to take away money that's against the halacha. Okay? Velo Amrin, says the Gemara on top line of Kuf Yudal al Dechad. That's only true if there's one person. Avo betray lo. But if there were two of you, then you certainly can go to a non-Jewish court because they're going to do the same halacha that the Jewish court would have done. And chad nami, and even if you're one person, lo amran ela bedina de migus gista. They only said it if it's dina de megista. I don't know how to translate megista. Rashi says it's b'nei kfar. People live in a tiny little village, meaning it's a little bit of a kangaroo kind of court. I'm not sure what it means, how the translation is, but the meaning it's a very low level court. You're muted. We didn't hear you.
A village court.
No, yeah, right. So, but I'm not sure the word megista means that. But either way, it's a small court. Aval beidavar. If it's beidavar, which Rashi says is the official government court, then in Hunami, they too in that government court, achad memona shadule. They one is enough. Rashi says that they don't necessarily make you pay; they make you swear, which is the Jewish halacha. And so, therefore, since they basically practice in line with what we would do, it's okay to give testimony there. Amar Ravashi. Now Ravashi said, "Ki havina be'Rafuna ibayla." When we were with Rafuna, we asked the following question. Some changed it to Rav Kahana, but either way, we asked the following question: Adam chashuv v'samchi lekibeitrei. Let's say you're an Adam chashuv, right? So the non-Jewish court summons you, let's say, to give testimony. You're a very respected person. So and therefore, mafki memona pumei. They're going to, even though usually the court we said requires two witnesses. If they're going to say, oh, this guy is really respected, we're going to listen just to him. And therefore, maybe lo ibayle lasude, you shouldn't go testify. Because even though you know the truth, the court, you're only supposed to testify if the court's going to rely on the proper halacha. And here they're not going to. Odilma, or do you say, and this raises all kinds of great questions, kivan da adam chashufu, since you're a notable, reputable person, lo matzi mishtamidla, you're not able to escape. Because you can't say, oh, I don't know anything, I forgot. They're not going to accept that. And so therefore you don't have an excuse not to go. And therefore you have to go, even though Rava just said on Amabed that we put you in Cherem, you don't have any choice here. And therefore, Matzi Lasude, and therefore you're allowed to testify because you'd get in trouble if you didn't. And therefore, Teku, we don't know the answer. So you see, it's much more complicated than whether you do it or not. The question is, what consequences do you have to accept if you don't do it, right? And in this case, where we're asking, maybe an Adam Chashuv wouldn't have unacceptable consequences. The non-Jewish, people would know and they would punish him, and therefore he's allowed to do it. And we don't have a resolution to that question.
What about following the laws of your local government?
So that's a really great question. You mean Dina de Malchuta, right? Is that your question? I'm not sure if you're asking, but so I think the question of Dina de Malchuta really.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Sorry, I couldn't find how to unmute.
That's okay. This was some of the discussion yesterday, and obviously this is not something we're going to resolve quickly. Is what are the limits of Dina de Malchuta Dina, right? Do you only follow the judgment if it's a reasonable judgment? What if it's quote unquote an unreasonable judgment? What if the Torah says one thing and the Malchut says something else? So there's certainly, where we talked about Dina de Malchuta Dina yesterday, it was these cases where you basically take taxes on behalf, right? Where presumably there's communal good and you have to follow these laws. But where there's something that contradicts the Torah, not everyone agrees that dina de malchut dina. Now, of course, that's a very controversial thing to say because you can see where people take that, and people have, right? But it does seem that if the Torah clearly says you need two witnesses, and the malchut comes and says you only need one, that's not within necessarily the limits of dina malchut dina if you can get out of it another way. That's our case here. But as we said in this case, what if they won't
So
let
wouldn't that prevent anyone from doing anything in American court?
So there are probably people who've taken it that way, but I think I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not that cynical, right? You wouldn't characterize all law as being unjust, right? There's things that are not addressed
No,
under.
but if the Torah says you need two witnesses and you go to court and sue someone, and you have one witness and a jury or the judge.
Right. So I agree, but that's what our discussion is about: how good the court is and how justified the court is, and whether you think they're going to really listen to the edut or not. Yes, the answer is that these are all questions that were asked and are discussed, and I would recommend following the current laws. Says the Gemara, Hi Bar Yisrael, the Zavle Arlovei Kachavim Mitzvah de Bar Yisrael Chavri. Let's say one Jew sells property on his border to another Jew, to another guy, sorry. So two Jews border each other on their fields, and he sells property to a non-Jew. Says Ravashi, Mishamtinale, that you throw that person, that you punish that person. Again, it's not, you can't make him pay. You can treat him inappropriately, and not kindly. My time, why? If it's because, well, there's a halakha that you're supposed to remember, there's a very clear halakha, which we're going to have much more of later on in Bava Metzia, where you're supposed to, if you're selling, you're selling your field, you have to give first right to the person who lives next to you. As long as they pay the same amount, we'll discuss the details. Because obviously it's more valuable to them to have contiguous fields, and you have to do that. So maybe because you sold it to a non-Jew instead of to the Jew who's next to you, that's why you're in trouble. So we're going to say in Bava Metzia, V'amar Mar, Zavun me'akum, if you buy it from a non-Jew, or sell it to a non-Jew, Zavin le'akum, leka mishum din de bar mitzvah. Those rules of bar mitzvah means the person on your border. Bar mitzvah doesn't apply. So you don't have to, it's only if you're selling it to a Jew that you have to do that. So that can't be why we're punishing you. Ella damrinale, because we say to the person who sold the field to a non-Jew, Arba'itli arit amitzra, you are raising lions on my border, meaning you've welcomed in these people who are going to bring down the whole neighborhood because they're not going to, protect their animals. They're not going to protect my field. They're going to creep over into my land. And so you're basically putting something like me at danger. It's a little racist. Mishamtinale, now you put him into chirim, until he says, I'm going to write a bond that if these neighbors turn out to be bad neighbors and they cause you damage, I will cover it. So that's what we expect. When you sell your field to something or some situation that can cause trouble, you have to accept the results of that, or we put you in chir. So that's another related halacha. And then I would just say many times, it obviously relates to the time and the place and what the situation was in that time.
Why wouldn't that also apply if he sold this property to a Jew who's not a good person, and that Jew would cause destruction of the neighborhood?
So it's a good question. We'll get to bar mitzvah a little bit, but the real reason is that Jew is responsible for their actions, right? So basically, it's not I can't stop this person from robbing you or doing something inappropriate, but you hold them accountable. But here, presumably, it was in a time or a place where it was difficult or impossible to hold a non-Jew accountable, let's say. Again, Ravashi, was talking about his time and place, and this would clearly depend on what the current, laws and circumstances were. We've seen throughout the Gemara, there are times where, a non-Jew, and we're going to see actually in a second, we're going to see later today, about robbers who are non-Jewish and whether you are more fearful of them or less fearful of them, etc. So it's very context and time dependent.
So if you have a new Jewish neighbor, you could have a bar mitzvah party.
Excellent. Continues the Mishnah in the middle of Daf Kuf Yudal. Let's say Natlu Muchsin et Chamuro. Let's say these tax collectors come along, and we said earlier that now, unlike yesterday where we said Dina de Malchut Dina and the tax collectors are permitted, we said earlier that we assume most tax collectors are thieves because they have permission to take, $1 million from the town, but they keep going and going and going. So Stam Moches is a robber, right? Is a thief. So the Moches comes to your house and they take your chamor. They say the government needs your chamor. and you go to court the next day. You run after him. You don't go to court. You go run after him the next day, and you say, I wasn't supposed to pay taxes. Whatever. You made your story, your plea, and he said, okay, I'm not giving you back your Mercedes, but take back this little tiny little Toyota, right? He gives you someone else's chamor that he has in his collection. So natnu mochsinet chamoro, but natnu lo chamor acher, but they give you back maybe of lesser value. It doesn't really matter for the Mishnah. Someone else's chamor, which they stole also, right? Or natnu listimet ksuto. Let's say the robbers come to your house and they steal all your finest ksut, all your finest clothing. But they feel bad for you and they throw you something else that they stole from somebody else. Says our Mishnah, you can keep the stolen cow, the stolen donkey, the stolen clothing, because you can assume that the first owners gave up. Because once the tax collector comes and collects from you, you're never getting that back, right? Once a robber comes to your house, you're never getting that back. So therefore, they gave up. And so it's essentially owned by the thief, right? And the fact that they gave it to somebody else, the other person can keep it.
Why do you say that? You yourself didn't give up. You ran after the person who stole from you and forced him to give you something back. So the second person whom he stole, maybe he didn't give up. Maybe he's running after him, and this goes on and on ad infinitum, where he's taking.
So it's a good question. I think the Gemara doesn't specifically say that you ran after them, but obviously there has to be some point where they left your house and you gave up on ever seeing them again or getting it from them. So but we'll discuss this in the Gemara, of course. But the assumption of the Mishnah seems to be that if someone steals something from someone else, they've given up ever getting it back. Continues the Mishnah, Matzil min nahar. Let's say you save something from the river, right? You find a beautiful gold ring at the bottom of the river. O min hagiyas, or you save something from the giyas is like the troops that come through, the army, who obviously plunder all along the way. So that anything they have is stolen. And you sneak into their camp and take something from them, right? Oh, min halistim, or you take it from robbers. So there's a camp of robbers, and either they run away or you steal something from them. Says the Mishnah, it's not so clear that you can keep it, which seems to be a direct contradiction to what we just said. Says the Mishnah, if the owners gave up because they lost their thing in the river or they lost their things to the army and they gave it up, then hare elu shelo, then you can keep it. So the Gemara is going to ask that this implies that you can only keep it if the owners gave up. And we just said in the first part of the Mishnah that if you get something from a robber, you can keep it because presumably they gave up. So the Gemara is going to ask that contradiction. But continues the Mishnah before we get there. Let's say you find a beehive, right? So someone's got bees in their backyard, as bees sometimes do. They get up one day and they fly away and they attach themselves to somebody else's roof, right? Their rafters. So that too is something that doesn't belong to you. And says the Mishnah, if the owners gave up, you lost your bees, you're never going to find them again because it's really hard to find your bees. The new person can keep it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, although we wouldn't generally accept testimony from some people, we do believe them to tell us where these bees came from. Nemenet Isha, o Katan, a woman or a minor who wouldn't normally be allowed to give testimony, is believed to say, Mikam Yatsa Nechil Zeh. Oh, this beehive, we saw it come from somebody else's field, and they tell which field. So we'll see why in the Gemara, why they would be believed specifically about that. And says the Mishnah, while we're on the hot topic of bees, let's say your bees are running away. And if your beehive leaves, you're never going to get them back again. And you see the bees running away after their queen through your friend's field. You can run straight through his field to save your bees, even though you're going to destroy things. If you step on his tomatoes, you pay back the tomatoes. But there's permission. We'll see in the Gemara, this is the Kana Yeshua made, because otherwise it's really hard to live in the land if you can't chase after your bees, that you can go anywhere. You can cross any borders to save your bees. Aval, lo yikotet suko amanat litain et adamim. Let's say you get 2 miles away to somebody else's cabin, and your bees have made themselves a beautiful home under his roof. You can't cut down his roof to save your beehive. Rashi points out, right? It's very difficult to convince bees to move, right? So generally, if you want to get them, you got to cut down the branch and take them with you, or find the queen, I guess. But Rashi doesn't talk about the queen, right? So you're not allowed to do this, even if you're going to reimburse them. You're not allowed to start cutting down people's houses. Rabbi Shmuel ben Yoshua ben Yochanan says, no, af kotzetz v'notin lo damim. You can cut it down, and you just have to pay, but you're allowed to actually cut down the branch or the house, or not the whole house, right? But the roof and the beam in order to get the bees. Okay, we'll get to the bees in a little bit, but let's go back to the first part of the Mishnah. Tana, there's a Braita that disagrees with our Mishnah. And the Braita says, Im Natal, if you take this stolen chamor or the stolen property from the robbers or the tax collectors, machzir leba'alim harishonim, you have to give them back to the first owners once you find out who they are. So the fact that they were stolen does not mean that you can keep it. And this person obviously holds, kasavar, yush kedi lo kani, that just because they gave up, which our Mishnah makes sound as a given, that's not enough for the ganav to be koneh. And just by giving yush kedi means yush alone does not give a kinyan to the ganav. Umeikara bi'isura taliyate. And when the ganav or the person who gave it to you got it through isur, and by giving it to you doesn't make it permitted. The ikadami, now some said that what the Braita says is not that you have to give it back, but if you want to return it, you give it back to the first owners as opposed to giving it back to the tax collector, right? Let's say you wake up the next morning and you say, I feel really guilty, right? I know I was wronged, but I feel really bad participating in this economy where basically they repaid me with someone else's stolen thing, and you want to give it back. You shouldn't go and give it back to the person who stole it, who gave it to you, the tax collector. You should give it to the first owners. My time up, because Yush Kidi Kani, it's true that Yush is Kona, and really you're allowed to keep it. Because since Yush is Kona, the first owners gave up on it because the tax collector never gives things back. But you really, as the second person, are allowed to keep this chamor, but you don't want to. Miu, amar, if you say, I don't want to keep something that's not mine, then at least you should return it to the first owners. Don't go and give it back to the tax collectors and say, I don't want anything to do with this. So you should at least take it from them, and although you're really allowed to keep it, you should give it back to the first owner if you want to make things whole again. Now, Hare Elu Shalo, so the first part.
So it's not a chiyuv then.
According to the Braita, it's not a chiyuv because in technical terms, according to this second version of the Braita, because since the first owners gave up and the Ganav took it,
Right.
it's not theirs anymore. So they have lost all claim to this thing. Now they could go and, just to be clear, they can always go and sue the Ganav. It's not like they, if there's such a society where you can do that, right? Assuming that's the case, but they can't lay claim to the exact object because since they gave up hope of getting it back, they lose the actual object. The object is owned by the Ganav, and if he gave it to someone else, that's a real gift for that other person. Continues the Gemara at the two dots right below the Gemara sign. Hare Elu Shalo, we said in these first cases, you keep the chamor, you keep the stolen item, because the owners gave up hope. Says Ravashi, Amar Ravashi, Lo shanu el listim ovei kochavim. This is only true if the robbers are non-Jews, because then you assume you're never going to see it again. Aval listim Yisrael, if they're nice Jewish robbers, then you can't keep. The second victim cannot keep things that were stolen from the first victim, because we assume that the first guy didn't give up hope. Savar, because the person thinks, look, they're Jewish, they're subject to my laws. The machar nakitna labedina, tomorrow I'll bring them to court. And so therefore I don't give up on getting my exact object back. I think I'll get it back. The courts will listen to me. Again, it's not clear at this point, it's not going to be clear even at any point, exactly why it's different between a Jew and a non-Jew. So the assumption is that not so much because the courts will go to a Jew or not a non-Jew, but that basically you feel more approachable, right? That if I take a non-Jew to court, I guess again in their society, they'll laugh you off. You have no standing to sue, or they won't come, whatever. But a Jew will at least you'll have a chance of getting it back from him in court. So you don't give up hope. And if you don't give up hope, the second victim can't keep the thing stolen from the first victim. Matkefla Rav Yosef, says Rav Yosef, I don't agree with that at all. I would say it's the exact opposite. Now, why would it be a non-Jew would be different than a Jew? Because if it's a non-Jew, you're going to go, and again, this clearly assumes that the courts are different. Akum didaini bigiti, and they actually changed the words here from Rashi and Bava somewhere, Bava Metzia, to begizita, gizataya. A non-Jew is judged in a court of gizataya, which Rashi says they use force. They use enforcement, so that there, lo miyayish Yisrael, the person, so lo miyayish, sorry, you don't give up hope, because since a non-Jewish court, you go to the court, and if they find in your favor, they're going to use force to take the thing away from the person and give it to you. So therefore, you think you have a good claim, you can prove this thing is yours, and they took it inappropriately, and you'll get it back. But a Yisrael, Kivan de Amri Meimar, this is very interesting. In the Jewish court, they don't have any enforcement application. They can just make a judgment, right? The Jewish court can say, we, the Beit Din Paskin, that this person stole from the other person. But remember, all they're doing is saying something, and this guy already stole it from you. So he's just going to ignore the court. So therefore, says Rav Yosef, Miyash, you give up because you have no way to enforce that. It's only in a non-Jewish court, which I guess would only apply to a non-Jew, that there's an enforcement mechanism. But in a Jewish court, they just say things. They just meme haramar. They just give a halacha. And since this guy doesn't seem to be interested in listening anyways, you're not going to get your thing back. Ella.
There are cases in other situations where the court, the kofi moto, Kane, or whatever the phrase is. So why wouldn't that be the case here?
Again, as I said it several times, it must be that it's very context dependent, that wherever place Rav Yosef lived, Jews went to one court, non-Jews went to another court, and the enforcements were different, right? That they only were able to say things. They're only able to give declarations. And if a person doesn't feel like they're listening anyways, you can't really enforce it against. Ella says Rav Yosef, you should say it about the end of the Mishnah. The end of the Mishnah said, something you say from a non-Jew, right? Or I don't know. Yeah, we didn't actually have those words in our Mishnah, but umina listim, or you steal it from robbers. Im nityashua balim, then in. If the owners give up, then you can keep it, but implying that stama lo, right? That if you steal something, that people don't give up and you can't keep it. And that's where Yosef would say, lo shanu ela akum. That's only true by a non-Jew, that you don't give up hope. Mishum the Daina Begiti, because they go to courts where enforce the rule. Listim Yisrael, Kima da Amri Meimar Miyash. Since Jewish courts only are saying things, a person who gets stolen from by a Jew really gives up any hope that they're going to get it back. So
that's the deal now with Jewish courts in America, right? That they just issue stock and they don't have any enforcement mechanism.
Okay, so I guess it was similar in Rav Yosef's time. I think Rav Yosef was in Eretz Yisrael, but I guess it was similar wherever that was. Now there's a Mishnah in Kalim, which talks about when a hide of an animal becomes tamei. Remember, things become tamei when they are in their final usable form. While you're still finishing it, it doesn't become tamei. So let's say you get a hide of an animal. Now, the hide of an animal, after it's been processed, can be used as a bed, right? The way it is. You just lay it out between mattresses, and it's a good surface, or you tie it up. But it also can be turned into a shoe or into a very finished product. So the question is, you have this hide, and you are not sure yet if it's finished or not. And let's say instead of doing an action, you have a machshava. You think, you know what? I'm going to use that hide as my new bed. Is that enough to change its status to a finished product and make it mikabel tuma, so that something sits on it that's tamei, it now becomes tamei? So says the Mishnah, orot shel balabayit, if it's owned by a regular civilian, then machshava metamatan. If you think about that you're going to use it the way it is, then it's a finished product, and then it's mikabel tuma. But if it's shel avdan, if it's owned by a tanner, or maybe not a tanner, by a worker, like a cobbler, right? I don't know what the word is for leather. Maybe it is a tanner. Then then thinking is not enough, because as the Rashi explains, but we talk elsewhere, because this person works in a store where he sells leather, right? And today he's no use for this. So he says, okay, I'm going to use it as a bed, or I'll sell it as a bed. But tomorrow someone walks in and says, make me a pair of boots. That's obviously much more lucrative. And he's just going to change it. So he doesn't really, just thinking it is not enough if you are a worker. But that's not why we're bringing this. The next part of the Mishnah is Shel Gazlan. If you stole the leather, right? And then you say, oh, I stole this raw hide. I'm just going to use it as a bed. Then ein machshava metamatan, your machshava does not change its status because you don't own it. It's not yours. You stole it. But if you're a ganav, remember that gazlan is where you do it and the person knows who you are. And a ganav is where you do it secretly. It says the Mishnah, machshava metamatan. Then you really stole it, and therefore the person gave up hope because they don't know who you are. They have no way of getting back their leather. And therefore you own it because they gave up. And since you own it, your machshava makes it tamei. And Rabbi Shimon says the opposite. Chiluf advarim, it's the exact opposite. If you're a gazlan and we know who you are, then the person gives up any hope they're ever going to get it back, because they assume, I know the guy, he stole it from me in my face. He's never going to give it back to me, and so I give up. And then machshava metamatan. If you're a ganav, then I don't know who the person is. He's scared of me. I'm going to go find the security tapes. I'll find out who it was, and I know he'll give it back to me once I find him, so I don't give up hope. And ein machshava metamatan, and therefore your machshava does not make it tamei because you're a ganav and you don't really own it. And that says the Mishnah, the Fishalon and Tiashua Balim, because the owners did not give up hope. Now says Ula, fascinatingly, Machloket Bistam. This is only true if you don't know if the victim gave up hope or didn't give up hope. And we're assuming if it's a ganav, they do, a gazlan, they don't, or according to Rabbi Shimon, the opposite. But Aval biyadua, if you know, if they say, I give up, I'm never going to get this mattress back, or never going to get back this piece of leather, then divrei hakol yiush kani. Everyone agrees that they've given up. If they say they've given up, which sounds obvious, but Rabbah says it's not true. Biyadua nami machloket, that even if they say it, they don't really mean it. Because if, again, depending on what you think, if let's say Rabbi Shimon, if it's a ganav, you give up hope. But everyone holds out hope that maybe tomorrow morning I'll find that diamond ring, right? Maybe we'll find the ganav. And even if you say you gave up hope, we don't believe you. Amalei Abaye l'Rabba. So Abaye said to Rabbah, that's a big mistake to say your opinion. Lo tiflug alad to Ula. You really shouldn't argue with Ula, who says, remember Ula says that if you know what they think, right, then it changes, right? It's none. Because what did Ula say? What did the Mishnah say? Because the Mishnah sounds a lot like Ula and not a lot like you. Because it says in our Mishnah, that you are kona something because the owners didn't give up hope, right? Now that implies that's only because you know that they didn't give up. If they explicitly say, we give up on ever finding this again, then then it belongs to the ganav. So you see that even if a person's a ganav, they give up hope, it belongs to them. Amarle anan lefi yiush shein yiush leba'alim matnitam, right? I understand the Mishnah to be saying not because they didn't give up, but because they don't give up. Not even if they say they did, we don't think that they gave up hope if it's something that's a ganav or a gazlan, depending on which way you looked at it. Okay, it's not. Let's look at our Mishnah and understand how the halacha is. Our Mishnah said that if the mochsin, remember mochsin are tax collectors, but you know who they are. So that's the equivalent of a gazlan. It's a person stealing from your face, right? A listim is a robber, which we think means a ganav, someone who's hidden from you. So our Mishnah said both of them, if you give up hope, and therefore they own it, and if they give it to somebody else, that other person can keep it. So now that doesn't go according to anybody. It doesn't go according to the Chachamim, who say it's only a ganav and not a gazlan. And it doesn't go according to Rabbi Shimon, who says it's only a gazlan and not a ganav, right? Because it says it's true about both, that you give up hope. So let's read our Mishnah. It's not. Our Mishnah said, Natnu mochzin chamoro, money. Who is the author of our Mishnah? If it's the Rabbanan, kasha gazlan. Why would a gazlan give up hope? The Rabbanan say that a gazlan never gives up hope. Rabbi Shimon, kasha ganav. Rabbi Shimon says a person who was stolen from by a ganav never gives up hope. So Bishlam Ula can explain our Mishnah very easily, because Ula said these are the assumptions, but if you explicitly say it, it's different. So it's the Amar Biyadua, right? It's where you know that the person, I'm sorry, Ula said biyadua kani, hachanami biyadua. Our Mishnah is where you know that the person gave up or didn't give up hope, and divrei hakol, and therefore it goes according to everybody. El the Rabbah, who said that da'amar biyadua nami machloket, that even if the person says, I give up hope, we don't believe them, and we don't say that they gave up hope if it's a ganav or a gazlan, depending on who you hold. Hamani, our Mishnah is lo Rabbanan, lo Rabbi Shimon. Says Rabbah, I'd have to explain our Mishnah. We are 6 lines from the bottom. Is belistim mizuyim. The listim are not robbers who hide. It's not a ganav. It's a robber who has arms and comes up to you and says, give me your money. And that's a gazlan, because you know who the person is. And so our Mishnah is gazlan, and therefore, and it's Rabbi Shimon who says, according to me, Rabbah, that with the gazlan, you always give up hope. It's only with the ganav that you don't give up hope. Says Gemara, well, then it's 2 cases of gazlan. Yihachi hainu gazlan. Yeah, that's not a big deal. Trey gavni gazlan. We're telling you 2 different cases of gazlan. So that's how I'd have to understand the Mishnah. Tashma. Now, what about the following braita? We are 5 lines from the bottom. Haganav, person who steals. A gazlan, which is clearly somewhat different, right? One is hidden and one is revealed. Or anas. Anas is someone who forces someone to give him something against his will, but pays him for it. Right, so he makes him a deal he can't refuse, but that's also considered gzela or chamsan. Hekdeshan hekdesh. If you steal something and give it to hekdesh, it belongs to hekdesh, which implies that you own it, right? That you were koneh with yish. Trumatan truma. If you take off truma, it's truma. Maserteim maser. So now money. Now who is this Tana who says that a ganav and a gazlan acquire something? So irabanan kash the gazlan, because remember they said by a gazlan you don't give up hope, and so therefore it shouldn't belong to the ganav. Rabbi Shimon kasha ganav. So again, same question. Bishmal Ulo says Biyadua Kani, that if you know that the person gave up hope, then whether it's a Ganav or a Gazlan Yerkona, Achanami Biyadua, V'divrei HaKoli. It's where you know he gave up hope, and it goes according to everybody. El the Rabba, the Amar Biyadua Nami Machloket Hamani. If even they argue, even if you say you gave up hope, who is it? Lo Rabbanam, Lo Rabbi Shimon. Answers the Rabbah, okay, so you have to say the same thing. The Ganav here does not mean Ganav, it means Listim Mizuyim. Hachanami Listim Mizuyim, Rabbi Shimon Yachi Hainu Gazlan. Well, that's the exact same case as the word Gazlan. So Tregavni Gazlan. The Ibai Dema, we have another answer, which actually seems like a little bit of a better answer than saying the word Ganav means Gazlan. It's that there's a third Tana. The Rabbanan say one thing, they say only Ganav, not Gazlan. Rabbi Shimon says only Gazlan, not Ganav. You give up hope. But this is a third opinion, which is Hamatnita Rebbe. This is Rebbe. The Tanya Rebbe Omer Ganav Ki Gazlan. Rebbe holds, turn the page, that a Ganav is the same as a Gazlan, and therefore what? Ganav Gazlan, and is it Yish or not Yish? Says the top line of the page. Well, we got a lot to do. The Kaimalan Gazlan Ki Rebbe Shimon. That Rebbe says that the Ganav is like a Gazlan, the Rebbe Shimon, where you give up hope. So according to Rebbe, whether it's a Ganav or a Gazlan, you basically give up hope a second it's stolen from you, and therefore the robber can do what they want with it, halachically, even though they have to pay you back, because they own it. Gufa. Now, says in the top word, we'll go through this quickly because it's it's a little bit repetitive. Gufa, Rebbe Omer. Rebbe says at the top line of Daf, Kuf Yudal Amabet, Omer Ani, I say Ganav Ki Gazlan. A Ganav is like a Gazlan. It says the Gemara, we don't yet know which way he goes. Remember, a Gazlan, according to Rabbi Shimon, gives up hope right away. A Gazlan, according to the Chachamim, there's no yish because you think you're going to get it back because you know the person. When Rabbi said Ganav ki Gazlan, does he say you don't give up for Ganav like Gazlan, or he said you give up for Ganav like you give up for Gazlan? So ask the Gemara, we don't know. Ibaylo, ask the Gemara, second line. Ki Gazlan de Rabbanan Amar, and you don't give up hope. V'lo kani. Odilma ki Gazlan de Rabbi Shimon Kamar v'kani. And you do give it. So we don't know. We already told you the answer, by the way, the top line. But now we're going to figure it out. Tashma. Let's prove it from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Natu mochsin chamoro. Robbers steal your chamor, and then they give you back someone else's chamor. So remember, our Mishnah had two cases, a moches, which is a gazlan, and you know him, and a listim, which we assume is a ganav. So ask the Gemara, as we asked right before, money. Who's the author of our Mishnah? I Rabbanan kasher gazlan. I Rabbi Shimon kasher ganav. I am Rabbi Shimon Rebbe ki gazlan ki Rabbi Shimon Rebbe gazlan ki Rabbi Shimon kamar. The Rebbe says that you give up hope by a ganav, just like by a gazlan, the kani, hamani Rebbe. So then our Mishnah would be great. Our Mishnah says ganav and gazlan, you give up hope because that's what Rebbe says. Mishamachi kani. Eliyam ki gazlan derabanan kamar, and you don't give up hope by either ganav or gazlan. Below kani, hamani lo Rebbe lo Rabbi Shimon lo Rabbanan. Our Mishnah goes according to nobody. It says, well, that's not a great proof because we answered on Amud Aleph that maybe the case of ganav in our Mishnah is not a real ganav. Maybe the case of ganav in our Mishnah is listed mizuyim, and that's also a gazlan. Says the Gemara, again, this is repetitive, as we just said before. Then it's a gazlan. Trey gavni gazlan. Okay, Tashma, we're going to prove from the second Braita. Again, exact thing we did on Amud Aleph. It says a ganav and a gazlan and a nas. Remember, a nas is a forced sale, which is called chamsan. All of these they acquire. Hekteshan hektesh. If they give hektesh, it counts. Trumatan truma, masrotei masar. Money. Now, who's the author of that Mishnah? Which groups together Ganav and Gazlan and says that the Ganav or the Gazlan acquires it. Who is that? I Rabbanan Kashle Gazlan. If it goes going to Rabbanan, then Gazlan doesn't make any sense because the Gazlan, they don't give up hope. I Rabbi Shimon Kashle Ganav. So now, I am Rabbi Shimon, that it's Rebbe, and Rebbe says that a Ganav is the same as a Gazlan of Rabbi Shimon, and you give up hope in both cases. I am Rabbi Shimon, that Rebbe says, Ganav ki Gazlan to Rabbi Shimon Kamar Mishum Hachi Kani. El I am Ganav ki Gazlan to Rabbanan. And you don't give up on either one, Hamani. Who is this referring to? And again, we give the same answer. Belistim mizuyim Rabbi Shimon. It could be that the ganav here is not a real ganav. It's listim mizuyim, which is a gazlan, and it goes according to Rabbi Shimon. Yachi hanu gazlan, tregavni gazlan. Amarle Ravashi the Rabbas. Now Ravashi says to Rabbah, if you remember Daf Yomi from 5 days ago, you're going to realize how ridiculous this is. Because Tashma, remember we learned earlier in the parak, twice. The Matni Rebbe Rabbi Shimon Brei. That Rebbe, remember it's the same Rebbe we're talking about, taught this Mishnah to Reb Shimon, his son, and he said, remember our first Mishnah of Perek said that if you steal something and you leave it to your children, they don't have to pay it back. And we said, but if it's a davar sheyesh b'achrayut, they have to pay it back. And said Rebbe to his son, Rebbe Shimon, Lo davar sheyesh bo achrayut mamash. We don't literally mean a field or something that's property that has achrayut. Ela afilu para, even if it's a cow, v'choresh ba, and you can plow with it. Chamor mechamer acharav, or it's a donkey, chayavim lahachzir. You have to return those things mipnei kvod avihem, because it's disrespectful to the father who died, who everyone's going to say, oh, look at his kids driving around their father's stolen car, right? Taima, but the reason you have to give it back is only mipnei kvod avihem, is because it's disrespectful to their dead father. Halav kvod avihem, lo, they wouldn't have to give it back. So why? Because you see that they give up. It's yish. Shma mina, the Rebbe says that a ganav is ki gazlan de Rebbe Shimon Kamar, and you give up hope right away that you're never going to see this thing again. And therefore, the robber really acquires it. Again, they have to pay back, but they acquire it, shma mina, and that's a good proof. Okay, let's do 5 more minutes. I know it's a little bit late, more than a little bit late, but we can get to the Mishnah in record time. Amar avchei nechil shel dvorim. Where am I? Yeah, and same thing is true about a flock of, it's not a flock, what do you call a swarm of bees? My v'chein, what do you mean, what's true? Hachikamar, this is what the Mishnah says. Afilu nechil shel dvorim, which are kinyan derabananu, because really no one owns bees, right? They live in your yard, but that's only midrabanan, because you can't, you don't enclose them. So since really it's only midrabanan ba'amu that you're kanile, afilu staman amu miyayish. The second they fly away, you give up. Kamash Milan, that no, it's only if you give up. But if you're still looking for your bees, no one else can keep them. In Nityashua Balim in Ilolo. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Broka Nemenet Isha Katan to say, oh, the bees that we found here came from somebody else's field. Ask them why. Isha Katan b'nei idut ninu. We don't generally rely on a woman or a katan to give testimony. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Hachma Ma'askinan. It's talking about Kigon Shahayu Ba'alim Miratfi Machrehem. The owners are frantically searching. My bees have run away, and they're running after their bees. This woman or this minor is saying a story that's not connected to court. That's a Masich Levi Tumam. I mean, you're just talking. So therefore, they say, oh, we saw this great big swarm of bees come out from behind the barn and fly down, Main Street. So therefore, and therefore you believe them because they're not coming to give testimony. They're sort of there's what's called raglayim l'davar, right? It looks likely that what they're saying describes what's happening. Now, says Rav Ashi, we're at the first wide line on Kuf Yud Dalet Amud Bet. Says Rav Ashi, Ein misiach lefi tumo kasher el leidut isha bilvad. The only time we rely on someone just talking, and they could be a minor or someone who's not kosher for edut, but kids are sitting around saying, yesterday we saw this great big balloon at the funeral of Joe. And we trust that means that Joe's dead, right? That is only true by Udut Isha, to allow a woman to get remarried, because we have special rules to be making for that. But we generally don't believe testimony that's not given officially in court by someone who can't to give testimony. I'm like Ravina Rav Ashi, but it's not true. What about our Mishnah? Our Mishnah said that if you can rely on a woman or a child to give testimony about where the bees came from, right? And there you're just talking. Says the truth is that, it's true about Nechil Shel Dvarim, but that's an exception because it's only Drabanan that you actually own the bees, and therefore we rely on less reliable testimony. Udaraita lo, but you wouldn't do this if it's a case of Daraita. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, this is a great story, 3 lines from the wide lines. Ma'aseh b'adam echad. There was once a case, and this unfortunately was very common back in the day when Jews were much less connected. I guess the whole world was less connected. Some child shows up, redeemed from some catastrophe, no parents, no relatives, we don't know anything about him. And we start interrogating this kid, right? Where are you from? What's your name? And we want to understand his Jewish status. And he says, there was a person who said, Shahaya Mesiach Lefi Tuma. He was just telling his story. He says, this is a kid, a minor. Zichroni, I remember when I was, really young, 3 years old. Shani Tinok, doesn't give an age, but I was a young kid. My father put me on his shoulders, right? So he was a very small kid. He took me out of school, which is, of course, everyone remembers those days. He took off my clothing and put me in the mikvah. And he gave me truma. I had to do this. These are all steps you got to do to eat truma that evening. And Rabbi Chanina said, the story was even better. This is the ending. My friends used to stay away from me because they knew I had to be tahor. They used to taunt me or call me Yochanan who eats chalot, which remember is challah, which is given to a Kohen. And so he basically told the story implying a memory of being a Kohen, and the Helu Rebbe the Kuna al Piv. And Rebbe made him a Kohen based on that story, even though he's not reliable for testimony. It's not external testimony, but still it was reliable because he was just saying the Truma. But that's Midoraita. Says Mar, it's not Midoraita because it meant Truma Dirabanan. In Rebbe's time, there was no Beit HaMikdash. And Truma, again, this is a big debate, but Truma was only Midorabanan. Ask Mar, Akati Doraita low, but it's no case Doraita. Do you trust testimony Misiach Lefi Trumo? Like after of Dim Yamar of Chana Kartigna. And some say Rav Achla Kartigna, Mishtayim Maaseh Ba Lefnei Reb Shulman Levi, Rami La Maaseh Ba Lefnei Rebbe. There was a story, but Tinok Echad, Shahaya Mesiach Lefi Tumo. There was one child who was telling a story. Again, you wouldn't rely on him for testimony. And Va'amar, he said, Ani v'imin nishbina lebeina akum. We were captives from non-Jews. Now remember, a woman who's a captive is assumed to be raped. And a woman who's raped is not allowed to marry a Kohen, midoraita. But this kid, young kid, says, me and my mother were captives, and there's external evidence, I guess, of that. And he says, Yatsati l'shov mayim, when I went out to get water, I didn't stay away. I didn't go away from my mother. Dati al imi, I stayed with my mother. Lokote tzim, when I went to get woods, which are, again, usually times where you would leave someone, dati al imi. I stayed, meaning I was able to see her, I was able to know about what was happening with my mother, and no one else came close to her. And so basically he's testifying that no one raped her. And Rebbe, Vesia Rebbe al Piv Likuhuna, Rebbe allowed her to marry Kohen as if she had never been forced to be raped, sorry. And based on this testimony, why? It's Doraita. Says the Gemara, B'shvuya hakilo, that, that's another case where they were Mako because it's a Shvuya. Rashi says it's only a Safek, but they were Mako in that case, but in a clear Doraita case, they wouldn't rely on a Katan. Let's read a little bit more. We got everyone's patience for 3 more minutes? Okay, I got it. We got the energy. Then Rabbi Yochanan Yoker says, this is a condition of Beitin. If your beehive goes to someone else's field, you can go and cut down their tree or their house and take that branch that has it and pay him back, right? You can pay through the beehive. Right? Let's say a person's honey pot breaks and the honey is very valuable and it's dripping to the ground. You can dump out your wine and save his honey and make him pay you for the wine, right? And tonight Beitin, there's a condition of Beitin. Let's say your truck is going down the highway and your friend has a truck full of, in this case, pishtan, which is very valuable, and your truck is full of, your animal in this case, is full of wood. You unload your wood and load up his pishtan to save his valuable stuff, but you got to make him pay you back for your wood, right? You unload your wood, and I guess it'll get stolen or get lost. And you take the pishtan, the seeds, the flax of your friend, because when Yeshua laid the ground rules for Eretz Yisrael, there were conditions like this, that when you do something that clearly benefits somebody else, you should do that at a monetary cost to yourself, and he'll pay you back. And you have to pay him back. It's not just voluntary. So those are the conditions. And we are up to the Mishnah. It's a long daf. Tomorrow's also long, but not as long. And I think tomorrow I'm okay learning in the evening. I don't know if anyone else has strong feelings.
Yeah, would be great in the evening for me as well.
Can we do 7 p.m.?
That works.
Yes.
Okay, that's the goal. I'll put in the WhatsApp. Got rolling 7 p.m. tomorrow evening, and reminder.
Morning would be better, but
What would be better? Morning?
morning would be better, but
We're going to do 7 p.m. tomorrow, but we'll take that. You'll get the next one. The truth is, next week I'm planning on traveling, so I can also only do the evening next Sunday. But we'll talk. We'll get there next week. 7 p.m. Remember, we're finishing Bava Kamma this week, so look forward to continuing tomorrow. Shavua Tov, everyone. Have a good night.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Thank you.